Okay, welcome back everyone. Today's lesson is all about materials and textures. And the material and textures lesson is going to be split across two different videos. Mostly so that they're going to be pretty short videos. The idea is if you want to work on material stuff, you have the material video to watch. If you want to work on texture stuff, you don't have to sit through all of the material to get to textures. So this first video is going to focus solely on materials, and then the second video will be all about textures. Material is basically the surface of a mesh. So when we talk about materials in Blender, we're talking about everything that has to do with our mesh's surface. I'm going to start with a brand new mesh. So I'm going to create a sphere in this scene, UV sphere. And I'm also going to go ahead and smooth that sphere so it looks a little more polished and refined. Now, by default, a material does not, a object in Blender does not have a material attached to it. So if I render this guy, I get a gray ball, but there's not actually anything being calculated about the ball's surface. I don't have anything to change about the ball's surface until I add a material to it. So let's figure out where materials live. Materials live on the button bar, and I'm going to make a little note of this. And they are the checkered circle on the button bar. And what I mean by that, if we take a look at the button bar right here, I'm going to zoom in for you guys. We can see that there's a little circle, and it looks like it has a black and white checkerboard pattern on it. That is our Materials tab. And we can see that our Materials tab looks pretty empty. That's because our sphere doesn't start with a material attached to it. I have to create one. So right here where it says New, I'm going to go ahead and click New to add a new material. And if you'll notice, if you were keeping a close eye on the sphere lights right up because I've now added this whitish color to my sphere. So when we talk about colors and materials, there's really two categories that we need to concern ourselves with. The first is diffuse, which is the actual color of the mesh. So the diffuse color is the color that the naked eye sees. If I click this little white blank space underneath diffuse, it brings up a color wheel. And in that color wheel, I have a wide variety of colors that I can select for my mesh. For my mesh today, I'm going to do a bluish green. But before I go away from this color wheel, I want to show you something else as well. We can choose the color. We can also choose something called the value. Value just basically means how bright is the color, how far along on the grayscale is it. So if I slide this slider way down, I'm getting a very dark green and blue. But if I slide it up, I get the brightest green-blue color I can get. I'm going to keep it there for now because I also want to show off one other part of diffuse, which is the intensity. So right down here, below where we picked a color, there is a value. Right now, it's set to 0.8. Intensity basically means how much of this color are we seeing. And right now, even though I have this light blue selected, my shape actually looks a little bit dimmer than that. It doesn't quite have that pure, bright blue. To get the full intensity, I want to increase intensity to 1. Now, the color here is pretty close to the color I picked on diffuse color. So intensity just increases the amount of color. If I drop intensity to 0, I get a completely black sphere. This is because all of the color has been taken out of the object, and now I have only black remaining. And if I were to do something like 0.5, then I get a dimmer version of my blue color. So diffuse is the color of the mesh, intensity is the amount of color, and it ranges from 0 to 1. 1 is the highest value we can have for intensity. That's completely full. Okay, so that's diffuse. Let's talk about our second category. Our second category is called specular. And specular is what we call the reflectivity of the mesh. All I mean by that is how shiny does the mesh look when it has a light near. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this light a little bit closer to our ball. Put it like right there. If we render this image, we can see a little pinpoint of light where our lamp is being reflected. The reason that that lamp is being reflected is because in my materials tab, I have a specular intensity of 0.5. So the amount of reflection is half of what it could be. The higher this intensity is, the shinier my object appears. So let's bump this guy up to 1.0 and see if we can see a difference. Immediately, in our little preview window, we see that this white dot got brighter and bigger. Let's check our F12. We can see that this little dot stands out much more. So we're creating a mesh that is much more metallic or much more reflective. It gives it this shiny, coated appearance. So what does it mean to have no specular intensity? Something with no specular intensity is going to appear much duller. So if I put 0 for the specular intensity, you can already see in the preview that this thing looks much duller, or much more dull. Bam! We have something that looks much more like a rubber ball, or maybe a very hard plastic ball, but something that doesn't reflect a lot of light. It looks like it's maybe been slathered in a coat of matte paint. Not very shiny at all. So usually if we want a metallic look, we want something much higher, like a 0.8-ish is good for metal or glass. And then if we're doing something like dirt or brick, we might drop the intensity to 0 because dirt and brick really doesn't reflect much light. So we've talked about the specular intensity, how does specular color affect the object? Specular color just means that when the object reflects light, what color does it reflect? By default, we reflect white. We can see that the color right here, the pinpoint right here, is white. And the reason we do that is because it's the most natural looking reflection of light. Normally, the sun in the sky or our natural light in our everyday lives is white light. So this makes a pretty reasonable, realistic looking reflection. However, I can change the specular intensity to be pretty much whatever I want. So if I want a blue specular intensity, and now I render, I get this blue reflection. So anywhere where the light is being directly reflected back, I get a bluish hue. And some of them are brighter than others, but you can play around with changing the specular reflection and see how that changes the tone of your image. This looks like maybe this ball is sitting outside during a deep sunset or something like that. It just gives a very slight hue to the reflected light. So diffuse is our color of the mesh, and our diffuse intensity is the amount of color. Our specular is the reflectivity of the mesh, and that is both color and intensity. So it determines how shiny we are. Okay, the really nice thing about materials in Blender, especially in this class, is that between diffuse and specular, we've got pretty much everything we need to be able to effectively use materials on a mesh. If we scroll down, there are a lot of options here, but we're going to dissect these one at a time over the course of the class. We're not going to learn about all of them today. Some of them we will never even learn about in this class because we don't need them. However, we are going to talk about transparency today. Transparency, much like it sounds, controls how see-through the object is. So we have diffuse, we have specular, and we have transparency. And transparency has an alpha value that also goes from 0 to 1. And this alpha value controls how see-through an object is. I'm going to go ahead and drop this specular intensity back to white just so it looks a little bit more reasonable. And then I'm going to play with a couple of different types of transparency. We're not going to worry about ray trace transparency, but I do want to talk a little bit about the difference between mask and Z transparency. Let's start by looking at mask. So when my alpha value is full, when my alpha value is all the way up to 1, right here, that means that my object is completely solid. It's not transparent at all. Let's see what happens if I drop my alpha to 0.5. And now, let's try to render our shape. We can see that our shape looks much more faded, almost like it's behind a cloud. What mask transparency is doing is taking the foreground and using it to obscure our shape. So it makes our shape look faded without actually making our shape see-through. If I were to drop this to 0, my shape would appear to disappear. But that's not actually what's happening. Let me show you a more concrete example. I'm going to bump mask up to 0.2 and render. This guy is looking pretty see-through, but is it actually see-through? To test that, I'm going to grab another object. I'm going to take a cube, and I am going to move that cube over here behind my sphere. Just like that. If you look, my camera can see both the sphere and the cube. Now, if this cube, or if this sphere were actually transparent, we would be able to see through it, but we can't. Mask transparency doesn't actually calculate whatever is behind the object. It's only making it look more faded from the front. So mask transparency isn't what we want to be able to get an actually transparent object. For that, we need Z transparency. So mask is going to make our object look faded without actually making it see-through. Z transparency is going to make our object see-through. So I've got my Z transparency set up. I've got my alpha set to 0.2. Let's see how this changes our render. Now, my object still casts a shadow, and it still has a little bit of a colored hue that we can see, but it no longer doesn't allow light to pass through it. Now, it appears transparent, and we can see our block behind it. So with Z transparency, we can get something much closer to glass or smoke or anything that's going to be partially see-through. Z transparency and the Z transparency alpha value are how we want to do it. So under transparency, Z transparency makes it see-through, whereas mask just kind of obscures it. We're going to use mask later to simulate fog. So mask is going to be really great for making it look like there's a haze in front of our object. But Z transparency is how we're actually going to make an object appear see-through. So for right now, those are the only 3 settings for materials that we care about. Diffuse, which gives us our material's color. Let's see. Diffuse and intensity. Specular color and intensity, so how our object reflects light. And then finally, our alpha value, which determines how faded an object is, with Z transparency making it see-through. So diffuse, specular, and transparency are our big topics for materials. In the next video, we'll talk about how we can use textures to make the surface of a material appear more interesting and to also give our objects more of a rough and 3D look. We'll be looking at that next in the textures video. Thanks for tuning in.